and it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer really standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Dark Matter Radio Network. Please remember to visit the website podcastufo.com for past episodes, blogs, and forums. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. We're starting an hour late this evening to accommodate the guest, but we're pretty excited to have him on. It's MJ Banias, and he's going to be talking about basically philosophy and UFOs. And he has a lot of really good points. And I have a lot of questions as far as this goes. So I'm pretty excited to have him on. Before that, we have Alejandro Rojas coming right up live with the news. I want to thank everyone that supports the show. And if you are not able to support the show and want to listen to the full show, you can always listen to it live. And it's usually at 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And that's on Podcast UFO. It's also on our YouTube channel. If you want to subscribe to our mailing list, you can see who our upcoming guests are. We send out a newsletter once a week. And that's right on podcastufo.com. You just put your email address in there, and that's it. And also, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and see when that is when shows are happening. We also have the Everything Else show. It's going to be on Monday nights, not every Monday night, but on Monday nights. And this one coming up is on lake monsters. So that should be pretty interesting with Denver Michaels. And also, if you can't support the show and you want to listen to the full show, it's on the Dark Matter Digital Network, and that's every Thursday night at 10 to midnight Eastern Standard Time. Alejandro, how are you?
I am good.
Thanks.
So, can people see me the whole time? Since,
no.
You know, I'm on the video.
No.
Just now. So I just came on. Hello, everybody.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't do that to you. I wouldn't do that to me. I wouldn't do that to you. Yeah.
Well, that would be, you're good at awkward, and that would be really awkward, because it feels kind of awkward. You're waiting here, and you see yourself, and you're like, am I on? Can people see me kind of?
Yeah. No, I'll do that next time, though. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how you doing?
I am doing well. Not too bad. Busy, but doing good.
I know last week we mentioned, of course, we had a crash last week. And what had happened, to let the people know why we didn't have a show, is we tried to go on. You were on the show, but no one could hear you, or they heard like every fourth word or something like that. It ended up being my YouTube software for streaming was trying to upload a new version, so update, and it just kept. I guess it was just attempting to, so it wasn't working properly. So I apologize to the listeners for no show last week. But anyway, the exciting news that you told everyone is that you and your girlfriend now own the UFO Congress. And congratulations. All right. Yeah, that was pretty good. Yeah.
So, yes, that's true. And actually, I think this is the third time we've talked about it, but the show keeps getting messed up or something, but or just not available. But yes, it's been a while now, so that's what's keeping me really busy. Although I've always been busy with the UFO Congress because I've been running it for years now. But really excited about it. We now are running everything, but people really won't see any changes. It'll be all of the same. I still work for OpenMinds.tv. We're still going to be talking about OpenMinds.tv news, and Open Minds is still a big part of the whole thing. So, yeah, really it doesn't change too much for people, but it's exciting for us.
And can you talk about any of the guest speakers you have lined up?
Yeah, so let's see. We've got a couple people that we have. Okay, let's see. I've got about 4 posted right now that we have public. We have a lot more that we're working on. But one of those is the return of Steve Bassett, so that'll be fun. He's been in Europe for a while. He essentially I think, after the election, he actually, a lot of people threatened to leave the country, and he actually did it. And so he hasn't been around too much in the U.S., but he is coming back for the conference, so it ought to be interesting to hear from him because, we haven't heard from him for a while, and he has a lot of stories to share about his efforts out there. Otherwise, we're going to have Bryce Zabel, and this is exciting. Have you had him on the show? Oh, you haven't had Bryce Zabel. So Bryce used to run the Academy Awards for a period of time, but before that he was a CNN anchor, and then he was also, but mostly he's worked in movies. So he's produced a lot of stuff. What was the name? Dark Skies, that television program, was mostly him. Like, it was his idea, and he got that done. But he's working on a couple movies right now. One called like The Majestic Men or something like that, they're going to call it, with essentially around Don Schmidt and Stan Friedman. That's who it's going to be about. They're going to have actors playing them. And then he's also working on a movie for Betty Hill and on the Betty Hill case. And these have been green-lighted already. So he's working on these projects right now. Big budgets, Hollywood type of deals. So he's going to be there. Really cool guy. I've known him for years. We're going to also have Jennifer Stein. She was supposed to be there last year, but she had a family emergency and couldn't make it. So she's going to talk about crop circles. I haven't seen this talk that she's going to do, but everybody who has seen it says it's going to be great. And the other person we're going to have is T.L. Keller. And he's interesting because he is an aerospace engineer. That's where he spent most of his life. So he's going to be talking about UFOs, an interest that he's had. He's also going to be talking about, are theirs or ours, the potential that some of these are black projects, that sort of thing, from his perspective as an engineer.
Great. Okay, well, that's a good little preview there. And I know February is a long way away, but I already booked the hotel rooms. That's all done. I'm excited to come out this year, and hopefully a storm will not keep me away like last year.
No.
So what's going on for UFO news?
UFO news. Well, I want to talk about this news. This is a story I wrote recently, although it's kind of old news, but I don't think it's anything we've talked about. Old news for us, maybe, because, for us, a week is old news. But a couple of these stories that came out recently and we haven't talked about, which is NASA hiring a planetary protection officer, and also the U.S. Air Force seeking funding for a Space Corps. So these are interesting, and they're kind of related in that the planetary protection officer position, of course, everybody got excited. It's going to be a position where they're, keeping UFOs away or looking for aliens and that sort of thing. That's what the headlines were, and that's what everybody assumed. But that's not really what it was. The Space Corps is the same kind of thing. Everybody's, the headlines were having fun with it. Are they going to be fighting aliens or something like this? But no, that's not the case. So the planetary protection officer, that posting went out for NASA, and people got excited. It got in the headlines, and a 9-year-old boy actually applied for it. He says he watches Guardian of the Galaxies, he watches all of the alien shows, and he thinks he would do a good job. So NASA replied, and I think they used this reply to this kid as a vehicle to kind of clarify what this job is, even though it says it in very technical terms in the job posting, which is really, this person is in charge of procedures for decontamination. So when we bring stuff back from the moon, or when we go to other planets, to make sure that we're not contaminating other planets and that sort of thing. So that's what this position is. They've actually had it since the 60s. So with all this new secret space stuff that's been in the, people talking about, has nothing to do with anything like that. It's more of a kind of a boring job. And it's kind of funny, if anybody saw Alien Covenant, they definitely could have used some of these protocols when the space colonists went flying out there. If you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. The Space Corps. Now, this actually was passed by the House to fund a Space Corps for the United States Air Force. And, it sounds exciting, and it is maybe somewhat exciting, but it's mostly around space. It is space warfare, but it's in competition, technologically with the Chinese and the Russians. So this is looking for different sort of space weapons in space. How do we create them? How do we keep the Russians and the Chinese from doing that? Really, the technology at this point is where we have, like, or at least the Chinese have, like, satellite jammers that can jam the communication from the satellite coming to Earth. That's the kind of area they're looking at now. We really don't have anything that can take out satellites. So they're practicing these sort of things all the time, lasers and other things that they can try to take out, like literally destroy them or just make them inoperable. So that's kind of what they were looking at doing. Essentially, it got to the Senate. The White House kind of laughed it off and said, hey, we're way too premature to do this. However, so it's probably not going to pass. But we do already have a Space Command, and the Space Command does similar things like this. It's a U.S. Air Force Space Command. They are in charge of those satellites that are out there. But they're also in charge of some of these, a lot of secret projects. Who knows what's going on? But as I've shared, I'm skeptical of this whole space fleet kind of idea. But we have seen in the news lately this little kind of tiny unmanned space shuttle that the Air Force has, and it is ran by Space Command, and it flies secret projects. In fact, it was in space for like a full year flying around. They haven't revealed what it was doing, but they have shown pictures of the object or of this craft and everything. So they've kind of even, told everybody, hey, we've got this craft, but we're not going to tell you what it's doing. It's probably taking pictures and stuff like that. But so that's if people were wondering, what about these Space Corps? And I have had some questions recently. What about these crazy NASA and Air Force Space Corps soldiers and warfare and fighting that they're trying to hire people for? That's been blown out of proportion a little bit. This is what they really are all about.
Hey, someone in the chat room wanted to know what your thoughts were on the recent MOD release of files.
Well, there were a few MOD files released, not a whole lot. I think there was something like 8, although there's supposed to be 13, so there's still some that haven't been released. It was frustrating that it took them so long. They were supposed to release these a couple years ago, and they said they were going to, but it got delayed by a couple years. But it doesn't have, and Nick Pope, I've interviewed him, maybe you have too, about, what was going to be in those files and some of those files that may be of interest. And he said there's no smoking gun in them, and there isn't. There are a couple interesting cases, but that's about all. So we've got some links, and we've been posting news on some of those interesting cases, and maybe I'll compile a story about, what they have, what they all have. What was frustrating about these files, though, was that in the past, when the UK Military of Defense or their archives have released these UFO files, they've shared them with the public digitally so you could download them. And they make them free for a month, and then you have to pay it for them after that. And in the UK, it's different. In the US, anything that the government creates, we can use. It's public domain for us. In the UK, it's different. They have copyright over them, so you can't use them without the permission of the UK government or paying them to use them. So, but what they did with these files is you could only get them by going to the National Archives outside of London in the UK to get these files. So you had to go get them print, photocopy them, and then you can take them with you. But that was the only way you could get them. So Nick Pope talked about this was probably because they didn't want them to make as much news as they have in the past. But Nick was intent on making them news anyway. And he did a good job of it because he did interviews with a lot of the different news outlets in the UK and some here on those files. But other than that, some of the local tabloids did some stories on them, but just nothing too exciting on those files. But some new ones did come out. But we're awaiting 3 or 4 more, and it is curious why they didn't release them all at once, and why they've taken so long to release these files, and why they've only made them available physically instead of making them available digitally as they have in the past.
Yeah, that is really strange why they have held back after all this time, and it makes you wonder why they would hold out even any at all if they were releasing, which is it's just strange.
Yeah. It is kind of strange.
I mean, if there was like thousands, I could understand them releasing, 2,000 and still 1,000 left. But I mean, if there's just a few left, that is strange to me.
It is strange, and John Burroughs was the one who called him out on it because he knew these files existed, and he requested these files. He wanted to see them, and they told him to wait because we're going to release them all. This was prior to 2008. They ended up releasing all the files, and these files weren't in there. So Burroughs kept, telling him, hey, we want these files. And they kind of ignored him. But finally, some British citizens read some of the stories that he had written. And so they followed up with requests, their version of the Freedom of Information Act requests. And then finally, they said we would release them. This was all the way back, this was 2014, I think. And it's taken them this long to get out. John Burroughs being one of the witnesses at the Rendlesham Forest, a U.S. serviceman who had a sighting on a base that was leased to the U.S. In the U.K. back in 1980, and he felt he had some physiological effects, and that's why he was interested in it.
Any sightings this over this last week or so?
Yeah, definitely. Have some pretty interesting ones. This one I like just because it is similar to what a lot of people see. And this is a point of light that people, a lot of people will report. I think, this is the most that I've heard. And this term is used the most, zigzagging, where there'll be a point of light, kind of like a satellite moving across, and then it zigzags around and flies off. A lot of people report this sort of thing. And this report is similar. This was at Ormond by the Sea in Florida. This was just on August 10th, where this gentleman who calls himself a military brat, and he served 14 years himself in the Army. He and his wife were out just kind of enjoying the ocean in Florida and enjoying the sunset when they saw something like this. They saw a light that just kind of zigzagged around and flew off. It's an interesting case. He kind of drew what it looked like, but I just felt it was kind of interesting because he's in the military. It really baffled him. And I think that a lot of people will feel that they've seen something similar because this is a very common report. But he also did make a graphic of essentially the movements of this object that you can see on the report as well. And then another one for people who like videos, because everybody's complaining, why doesn't that UFO sighting have a video or a picture? Well, some of them do, but as you'll see in this sighting, they don't always add a lot of information, but it is kind of weird. And I don't know if you looked at this one, Martin. This one's from Brazil.
Oh, I saw that. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird video. It's from August 6th, actually 2017, when this person saw what looked like just two objects kind of flying together. One of them faded out, and one of them was still there. He was able to get a picture of this with his phone, and it's just an odd shape. It's kind of like there's a kind of fish that kind of has like a similar kind of shape. Look at this. I can actually kind of show people who are watching the YouTube from my phone. Look at that weird shape. What the heck is that? And you could see that flying along in this video. It's a short video. It's not that great of a video, but it was kind of interesting. It was kind of cool because what this guy did was also zoom in on an aircraft to just show, how well his phone could zoom as, to show the relationship. But, I don't know what that was. That was kind of a weird one. So people can check that out, watch the video, and see what they think.
All right, Alejandro. Well, we'll be seeing you next week at the regular time.
We'll see you next week.
Thanks for coming in late on this one.
Yeah, no problem. And just remind people they can find this at openminds.tv, all the stories we talked about.
That's right. All right. Take care. Talk to you next week.
Take care.
Bye.
See ya.
I can't hang you up. You're going to have to. All right. So.
What if I don't?
Then you can join us for the show.
MJ is great, but I'll let you talk to him.
Take care. All right. So our guest, MJ, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
I'm real excited to talk to you. I think a lot of what people think about UFOs is all based on philosophy, because we certainly don't have, we certainly don't have any evidence. And so this is what. First of all, before we get into anything, what sparked your thoughts on this whole situation?
I think, I sort of come at it from, the way most of us do growing up. You sort of watch, a lot of the UFO shows and, X-Files and Star Trek and all that. So, as a kid growing up, I really enjoyed sort of science fiction and the idea and the possibility of life elsewhere in the universe as a sort of a subject. In university, I studied critical theory, which is sort of my academic background, and critical theory is basically sort of cultural philosophy. We talk about primarily sort of popular culture, mainstream culture, and how and why we sort of live our lives, day to day. And my focus in university was on subcultures. I really enjoyed talking about why certain people sort of congregate and discuss certain sort of specific things that are generally not considered normal or mainstream or popular. And over the years, I sort of realized that UFO culture or UFO subculture, or the UFO community, sometimes we call it, is something that's very interesting. It's an interesting group of people to look at. And as I sort of started looking into it a little more, I became interested, and I sort of, I guess, unofficially joined it, became a MUFON field investigator for a while, and really just got into the subject, got into the community, and ever since it's kind of just like a train gone off the rails and into, I can't stop it now and it's out of control. But to go back to your initial point, it doesn't take long for someone who walks into the UFO culture to see that we've been kind of running over the same old ground, and the science has been running over the same old ground and has ultimately solved nothing. 70 years in, if we sort of state as 1947 being sort of the unofficial start of UFOs, or at least popular ufology, nothing's really been solved. Like you say, there's no evidence. So I think we need to approach the UFO question from a different standpoint, and I think science is definitely one sort of aspect of it, but definitely philosophy and theory and culture studies and other disciplines definitely need to get themselves involved if we're ever going to sort of come to some sort of conclusion.
When you were a field investigator for MUFON, did you investigate any cases that you thought were baffling, that thought there was really something to this?
I think ultimately, in my entire career, and it wasn't long, I have to be honest, I was only in MUFON for about 2.5 years. My plan was to stay longer, however, just sort of due to political reasons and the political climate of MUFON sort of over the last couple months, I'm sure, most of your audience remembers sort of the debacles that occurred sort of in a row for MUFON. I decided that, MUFON is an organization that I can no longer be a part of, sort of just personally, as well as just sort of what I personally believe as a person. That sounds silly. What I personally believe as just a human being on this planet who doesn't want to be involved with sort of certain people, and I guess due to politics have to remain in positions within the organization. I also have philosophical problems, I think, with MUFON making claims that it's a scientific body, meanwhile hosting symposiums concerning topics that are not at all scientific, and are completely speculative, with little evidence to support them, if any. So I had my separations with MUFON. Overall, to answer your question, there was one case that I sort of listed as an unknown, only because I could not figure out in any way, like I couldn't disprove it, that what the sighting was. So I did list it as an unknown. I did sort of put a caveat in there saying that, I doubt this is something that is, otherworldly. But it was definitely something I couldn't explain. It was definitely something that as I sort of did the research and, looked at all of the data out there, flight patterns, meteorological events, talking to the witnesses, there were 2 of them. As far as I know, they saw what they saw. So that was an interesting case for sure.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Now, the French had a report. I'm trying to remember the name of the report on UFOs. You know which one I'm talking about?
Did the one that
Yes,
Leslie
that's
King
right.
talked about?
Yeah. It's
Slipped my mind right now.
my mind. But Leslie did, the only reason she got involved in UFOs, I'm sure you know, is because of this report. She read the report and thought, wow, if this is, the extraterrestrial theory is their best, their best guess of what is going on, and a team of scientists. And, what do you think about that report? The thing that I've heard you say in another interview, and I agree with you, is that people do jump right on the bandwagon that everything's extraterrestrial.
Right.
So what do you think about her, getting involved in this because of that report?
Sure. I have nothing but respect for Leslie
same
King.
here.
I think she's definitely coming to this, and she's definitely someone who I think the UFO community needs. She's definitely very bright, and she's definitely a good researcher. I think if we sort of, the core of the question here is the ETH, right, the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and why has the extraterrestrial hypothesis become the go-to position for people within the UFO community, most people within the UFO community. There's definitely people who sort of disagree with it, and this is an interesting question. I fundamentally don't know why extraterrestrials have become this sort of standard idea by which we say, if UFOs are intelligently controlled, they must be piloted then by, beings like you and I. They're just maybe smarter and they look different and they have better technology that seems magical to us. But, we tend to fall back on this. And I have to be honest, I think primarily it's a cultural thing. I think primarily we believe, the UFO community in general believes in extraterrestrials because we've been fed that story for a long time. Star Trek, Star Wars, The X-Files, Alien, all of these sort of films and TV shows that have constantly kind of reinforced this idea. Even into earlier, the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, there were the comics and the radio shows talking about, space aliens. So this idea of beings from other planets is something that you and I can easily kind of talk about. We can talk about it easily because they're like you and me, right? We kind of can approach the ETH because you and I are, made of meat, and we have free will and agency just like they do, and we have technology just like they do, and we are starting to go out into space, and they've been doing it for, it's easy for us to comprehend something else like us, like ourselves. However, there's a lot of people, especially now, especially younger UFO researchers, who are looking at the UFO question not from sort of the place of extraterrestrials, but rather from something else. Something strange, and I've said this before, I believe something strange is going on. What that strange is, I have no idea. But it definitely, when you look at the evidence, and you look at sort of all evidence equally, and that's hard to do sometimes because we often approach UFO cases from kind of our own ideological baggage, right? Some stuff sounds okay, some stuff sounds totally nuts, and we shouldn't believe it, right? If we kind of look at it all evenly, the ETH doesn't fit. It doesn't fit at all. There's so many moments of high strangeness that don't jive. Why do we believe that it's a species of aliens or maybe a dozen species of aliens kind of doing stuff? It doesn't make sense. And like I said, right, I've talked about this many times before in various blog posts, as well as on other interviews. But I think we approach the UFO question from the ETH from culture, but I think it's illegitimate.
Well, I tend to think that they're at least part of it. I have said on the show a number of times that it may be perhaps the UFOs are something we haven't even thought of yet, or can't even imagine. And I think that's definitely a possibility. But I also think of it, yes, I understand where you're coming from. And you probably get a lot of people in ufology kind of hammering you because of your thoughts about this. I can imagine possibly, but we can talk about that. But I do think it's possible that at least some of the UFOs could be visiting us. I think it makes sense. But I also realize that we can't help but put ourselves, humanize what is going on. That's the problem. We always think like, well, we would do it, so why wouldn't they do it? And, if something develops in a different solar system or whatever, millions of years ahead of us, who knows what their way of thinking and acting, are. Maybe they can't even conceive of what we conceive of.
Yeah, this comes up often, right? This comes up often in the UFO narrative, where you have these beings, and they're very similar to you and I, right? They're so similar, in fact, that we sort of have stories of hybridization, and we have stories of sexual encounters between humans and these others, whatever they are. And not only that, we often approach them in sort of human ethical terms, right? We say that they're either peaceful or malevolent. We even differentiate between the experiences we have with them, right? We differentiate a contact experience, which is usually benign, peaceful. They're here to impart a message upon someone. This is a contact moment. And then we have an abduction experience, right? This is the negative. This is when we view them as evil beings. They're malevolent. They're here to test us, and they're here to prod us and poke us and do sort of horrible things. And we apply this very human ethical system to something that isn't human. And fundamentally, we need to ask ourselves, why is this? Furthermore, we need to understand, I think, that a lot of our anxieties, a lot of our fears, sort of as a culture, we place upon them, whatever they are, the other, the alien, or the intelligent sort of beings that are often showing up in the narrative, because they often come to us with sort of very human messages, right? And this has been happening since again, the dawn of ufology with Adamski and all those guys. They've been talking about space brothers and peace, love, and saving the planet from nuclear bombs and global warming for a long time. And a lot of this narrative sort of hasn't changed. And maybe it's because we haven't changed and we're still sort of afraid of those things. But it makes you wonder why they would potentially sort of care about sort of those ideas. And furthermore, that they can even talk to us about those ideas. We make a lot of logical leaps and a lot of assumptions that they can even communicate with us, that our brains can even jive in some sort of communicative sort of language or telepathy or whatever. To suggest that they are going to be anything like us is, again, very speculative. And again, if we go to the witnesses, it's the witnesses' sort of stories that create this narrative. It's not that the witnesses are lying, and it's not that they're delusional. They are probably very much having real experiences. However, we have to remember that it's people interpreting experiences. And humans have this sort of safety switch that kind of, whenever we experience anything, we always interpret it in a way that makes sense to us, right? We always try to make everything make sense to us, and this is perfectly normal.
It's evolution,
sort of
actually.
Safety.
Yeah.
It literally is, yeah. I mean, we're designed to see certain things. We're designed to understand certain things in certain ways, so we don't die. And we often, I think, place our ideological selves upon these beings, whatever they are, and to suggest that they can easily communicate with us, or anything, that they're even like us in any way, I think that is just sort of human interpretation being placed upon them, whatever they are. And this is why, again, I have problems with the extraterrestrial hypothesis, because if they were just people like you and I flying around the galaxy, they wouldn't really function like you and I. They would be totally different, follow a completely separate evolutionary path on a totally separate evolutionary lineage and plant, to suggest that they're, reptiles, for example, in one narrative, right? The reptilians or whatever. That's crazy. I mean, how do you know there's reptiles on other planets? You know what I mean? Like, what reptiles evolved on Earth, they did not necessarily evolve anywhere else in the cosmos. So again, it's these logical leaps the UFO community kind of takes. And yeah, I do definitely get flack for it. I'm sure I'll get a couple interesting comments on this on this
well, we can
podcast,
actually,
sure.
in the second hour, I'm going to, toward the end, I'm going to ask if anyone wants to call in, and so they can do that.
Great.
Yeah, it should be interesting if we get some calls. So one of the cases I think is totally amazing, and a friend of mine is creating a film on it, is the Ariel School, the Rua, Zimbabwe. That particular case is really something. And how would you think you would interpret what those children saw in any other way, in a different way?
Right. Well, I think, and again, I know a bit about the case, and I've heard that one of the overarching problems, I guess, with the case, and this is what the debunkers have said, I'm not necessarily agreeing with them, I'm just sort of restating what they've stated, is that some of the descriptions of what occurred and the entities or whatever weren't sort of the same across the board, right? There were variations in the testimony of the kids. So this leads me to believe and this should lead anyone to believe one of two things. One, they didn't make it up, but they sort of imagined it, and that's why there's variation in the story. Or two, something did happen, something legitimately happened, but the children interpreted what occurred, where they came from, their ideological backgrounds, interpreted what occurred differently based upon them, right? Very similarly to, I'm sure some of your audience has seen the film The Arrival.
Yes.
That
was really good.
Yeah, certain characters in the film interpret the heptapods in one way, and some interpret them in the other way. And the one who sort of interprets them the best, played by Amy Adams, she learns to speak their language, and she sort of sees them, I suppose, for what they actually are, right? She can sort of move past the illusion of the heptapod. I think potentially in this Ariel case in Zimbabwe, I think what you have is an anomalous event, and I think you have a group of people who approach that event from their own sort of personal backgrounds and from their own ideological place, and interpret it differently. So I think for me personally, this is why you have a variation of what occurred or what they saw. And we see this in the UFO narrative all the time. You have you have thousands and thousands and thousands of abduction cases involving the Greys. You also have thousands of UFO cases where people see giant owls and bunny rabbits and 8-foot giant beings with horns and goblins. I mean, you have this insane variation of UFO testimony. To suggest that it's extraterrestrials is difficult, because ultimately what's going on with the extraterrestrials? How come sometimes they look like Greys? How come sometimes they look like owls? How come sometimes they're 8 feet tall? And ultimately what occurs is you either have to then say, well, there's hundreds of races visiting Earth, hundreds and hundreds, because they all fly different ships too. And in the 1800s they flew airships, made out of hydrogen. And they spoke English, and they needed water and gasoline to fly them. In the 1950s, they had saucers, and in the 90s, they had triangles. So, ultimately, what's going on if it's extraterrestrials? I personally think it's something else. I personally think we're dealing with something intelligent. I think we're dealing with some sort of strange phenomenon, but our personal interpretation of it is what makes it sort of real. It's what gives it shape. And the kids in Zimbabwe, I think this is what happened. I think they fundamentally saw something anomalous, something strange happened, and they interpret it in their own way.
Well, it'll be really interesting when Randy gets that film completed, because it'll, what he's basically done is interviewed these kids again today, in their 20s. And actually, I'm going to have one of them on the show with him coming up. I've already met Emily, and she gave a talk out at the Phoenix UFO Congress 2 years ago, I guess it was, and actually brought a lot of people to tears, because it was such an emotional, situation for her. What will be really interesting is to see the film when it's completed and hear all all what has happened to their lives as they moved on and what they actually think about and the differences in what each of them say about what happened that day. One of the things I think is really interesting, and for young children to come up with this on their own is kind of bizarre, is a few of them were saying that, the thoughts that they had to do with us taking care of the earth, that bad things can happen to the earth if we don't take care of it. And you do hear that a lot, but for a young child to say that's that would to just make that up would be very very strange. So
I agree, and I don't necessarily think anything was made up. I honestly think sort of the events in Zimbabwe, like I said, something did happen. I'm just not sure if it was aliens from another planet, and I think that's kind of where maybe I deviate a bit from sort of some of the others within the UFO community.
The old saying, "I know what I saw," type of thing. I had a sighting that I don't think could be explained. Back in 2006 in Monterey, in the Monterey area, I was in Carmel Valley, California. But also, the one way it could be explained is that it could be something. It could have been something military, although it was a perfectly shaped round disc. And the thing that astonished me the most about the whole entire sighting, and I had never heard anyone else say this, is that the thing was moving without making any sound.
Right.
So when I say I know what I saw, but I don't know if it was extraterrestrial. I have no idea what it was, but I certainly know that I saw something. What do you think people are seeing? What are your thoughts on that? If you don't think it's extraterrestrial.
Okay, so we're getting to the core of it now, are we? Perfect. Personally, I don't know. I can't answer your question. I have to go with. Sorry, let me start over here. I think I have to start with I don't know, and the main reason for that is because anyone who's sort of within the UFO community says this is exactly what's going on 100% is either delusional or trying to sell you something. And that's across the board, right? If they say, I know exactly what's going on and here's what it is, your BS meter should be going through the roof. So let's start there. So anyone who thinks they know what's going on, you can visit my website. No, anyway. I think what we're dealing with, and this is, again, personal opinion. I'm not an expert. I don't know. All I have behind me to support me in this is what the witnesses say, and the fact that what the witnesses say doesn't always jive. The fact that the significant pile of evidence out there, sighting reports especially, and witness encounters that do not fit in with the extraterrestrial hypothesis. So I'm kind of going on pure witness reports, and I'm weighing them evenly. I'm not, there's going to be hoaxes, and there's going to be people who are delusional. There's always going to be that. But you still have a huge chunk, a huge core of people who have had strange experiences, and they do not sort of coalesce into this nice, tidy package of it's ET. I think what we're dealing with is something that we've potentially as a species have been dealing with for a long time. I made a joke to someone once. I've become Jungian in my old age, and I believe that what we have been dealing with for a long time is what Carl Jung has often described as a sort of a universal consciousness, a sort of an intelligence that exists within our collective minds as a species. We are all sort of part of the same tapestry, and there are other things within this tapestry that also exist. They're not necessarily evil, they're not necessarily good, they just exist. When we interact with these things, whatever they are, our own sort of concepts of good and bad, our own concepts of right and wrong, our own ideological background is what makes them real. They're sort of out there. We give them, physical presence, and we give them the ability to interact with us. we see this sort of in a couple ways. Jung often talks about in his psychology the idea of archetypes, the fact that it doesn't matter whether you were born in North America or whether you were born in the Middle East or in Africa or wherever, and it doesn't matter if these cultures were born thousands of years ago or these people were born thousands of years ago or they're born today. We all have a fundamental understanding of sort of messages and ideologies. The good guys are always sort of similar. The bad guys are always sort of similar. We also interpret things differently. We always interpret things similarly. Certain animals we often interpret as being wise or good or evil or symbols of death or whatever. And this is sort of universal. This is a universal idea, this idea of the archetype. And Jung often talks about that the reason why these archetypes are all similar for everyone on this planet is because we're all sort of tied in together. There is something that's binding us together, some sort of consciousness. And like I've said sort of just now, there's something present within this consciousness. Like I said, it has some sort of intelligence, and when we interact with it, it sort of comes forward in some way. It's not necessarily extraterrestrial. It's not from another planet. It's just not human. And I think that this is sort of what we're dealing with. And philosophers have been talking about this for a long time. This isn't new. Aristotle talked about this thousands and thousands of years ago. So, you know, we're not dealing with anything strange or new in the philosophical world. But I think in the UFO world, I think this, you know, Jung kind of brought it up, and I think it hasn't really gotten the same traction that the ETH has. And that's why the ETH is definitely sort of the popular discourse right now.
Do you think this sort of ties in with other paranormal events? I have a friend, Paulino, who talks about sort of the multiverse, you know, having something to do with like crossovers and things like that. And this is interesting what you're saying about a not human.
Right. You know, and I think that this often comes up, right? This often comes up with, you know, the UFO question, and we often, you know, we often lump UFOs in with, you know, ghosts and Bigfoot and cryptozoology and all these other things. And there's definitely a lot of people within the UFO community who sort of buy into this, this idea that it's all connected. You know, I'm not sure. Again, I can't speak for it because I don't necessarily know what this thing is. This is just a sort of a personal opinion that I come to sort of via reading and research. You know, being human, I'm sure my opinion will probably change, you know, within a few years because I bump into some other piece of evidence that blows my mind and suddenly, you know, oh, it's aliens, you know. You know, I don't know. I hesitate to say sort of it's all linked together sort of with paranormal stuff. Do I think humans have been interacting with this intelligence, whatever it is, for a long time? Yes. Is it sort of ancient aliens, that type of they built the pyramids? No, I don't think it's that. I think it's more when humans have strange moments happen to them, anomalous events, strange synchronicities, when we have odd experiences of deja vu, or we think something's watching us, or we have moments where we believe we're like you say being visited, you know, by something. I think this is what that intelligence is. I think that's what we're interacting with. A UFO sighting is simply our interpretation of that intelligence from our cultural standpoint. 500 years ago, people didn't see, you know, black triangle UFOs flying through the sky and extraterrestrials with needles and strange devices, you know, technological devices. They would have seen something else. They would have seen fairies, or they would have seen, you know, elves, or they would have seen, you know, some other creatures that they would have been able to explain via their own sort of ideological and cultural and social background. Today, you know, we live in the 21st century. You know, we see you know, flying discs and stuff like that, because we come from that cultural place. Nobody sees fairies anymore, really. Nobody sees elves anymore, really. More people have UFO sightings than probably any other sighting of any other paranormal or sort of anomalous thing. I think there's probably more UFO sightings than Bigfoot sightings. So I think we're just sort of approaching this intelligence from our own place, and we're placing our interpretation upon it and making it seem real, or making it seem physical, like a flying saucer or a black triangle or an alien or a gray or a reptilian or whatever. And I think we just come from our own place and we place it upon that.
Are there studies that are following along this line, your line of thinking? Are people doing any type of study? Because this would be a big deal, you know.
Yeah, Jacques Vallée sort of does go on this route, right? He would argue, he's sort of, I think, one of the biggest proponents of this case, that it's not extraterrestrials. Jacques Vallée would probably say it's something that's been around for a long time that we've been dealing with, and he often links the UFO situation to sort of ancient cases of, like I said, elves and fairies and goblins and whatever that people used to experience. When it comes to actual sort of scientific cases, I'm not sure what you can scientifically track here, because ultimately, how do you prove any of this? How do you go about and test for this? One thing I'll say is there's one gentleman by the name of Jeff Richmond. He writes a great blog. You can Google him, Jeff Richmond, and he has a project called Project Oculus. And what he's basically done is he believes he doesn't necessarily believe what I believe, but he sort of believes, I think, that it's not extraterrestrials, it's something else. And what he's basically done is he's wired his entire house with cameras. And he purposefully places himself in sort of these marginal states. He makes himself uncomfortable. He throws off his schedule purposefully, so he wakes up at odd hours, and he doesn't get proper night's sleep, and he does all these strange things to keep his life off balance. And what he believes is if you keep your life off balance, if you don't live by sort of a steady 9 to 5 kind of grind, you are more open to having anomalous experiences. So what he's done is he's purposely placed himself in this sort of lifestyle, and then he's basically recording his whole life on camera inside his home. And he's caught some interesting anomalous things inside his own home. And I think, you can go to his website and you can just, it's like I said, you can Google Jeff Richmond or you can Google Project Oculus, and you can definitely see some of his evidence that he's picked up. But it's an interesting idea because what it does is it sort of flies in the face of the extraterrestrial hypothesis. An extraterrestrial being or an extraterrestrial intelligence, wouldn't care whether you're uncomfortable or whether you're comfortable in your daily life. They would simply go about their business and you would go about yours. And if the two of you bumped into each other, that's the way it happens. Richmond doesn't necessarily believe this, and Project Oculus is attempting to kind of prove this in a sense, this idea that people who place themselves or people who are in these sort of marginal, uncomfortable states have more experiences with anomalous activity. It's not necessarily flying saucers and UFOs, but it's a whole bunch of other stuff as well. It ties in UFOs for sure, but it also ties in other paranormal phenomena. So I think this is sort of one of the few things that's actually happening sort of to try and be objective. I think this is more of a philosophical project for me than it is a scientific one. I'm not a scientist by any stretch of the imagination. All I have is sort of rationality and logic and reasoning behind me. And unfortunately, for me, the ETH doesn't stack up. However, sort of this idea of an other intelligence out there, not necessarily alien, but just something, does. Mm-hmm.
I know there's been a couple of studies with abductees through the Free Foundation, or now it's called the Edgar Mitchell Foundation, as well as Kathy. I'm not trying to think of Kathleen Martin. Yes. Yeah. And Denise Stoner. They've also done some studies on the commonalities of these people that have been, claimed to have been abducted. And I'm wondering, I'll have to speak with Kathy and find out if what you're talking about, a disruptive life, I wonder if that's part of what's going on with the commonality of them.
Potentially it could be. I don't know much about, the Edgar Mitchell Foundation, and I've heard of Kathleen Martin, but I don't really know. Like, I've heard of her, but I've never really read much of her work. I think I don't want to sort of interpret things and sort of purposefully sort of derail the conversation, but ultimately, again, I kind of I get sort of icky feelings when people sort of again make claims to know things. And say this is 100% what's going on, and and then sort of try and sell it to me. So, I'm going to sort of reserve judgment on this. Like I said, my theory or sort of my belief is just that. It's a theory and a belief. And I'm trying to kind of figure out ways of proving it. But again, the beauty of being sort of a philosopher, not a scientist, is I can change my mind really anytime. Because I can just compartmentalize my own sort of existence and my own thoughts and sort of philosophize in different directions. Yeah. Like I said, I don't know enough about their work to sort of go much further than just saying that. If their work is free and their work is just sort of, here's all of our information, have at it, perfect.
Yeah, that's basically what they're doing. But they're what they wanted
Right.
to do was anonymously track all the information to see what was in common with these people that were claiming.
Right.
And my only question is I wonder what if they had, say, less than the normal sleep, or
Right.
if they were disrupted in other ways, because you do hear about my son has insomnia a lot, and he's had times where he's had not night terrors, but he'll have where he can't move, and he'll think he sees something at the foot of the bed.
Yeah.
That's similar to, I'm not saying that's what these people that are claimed to be abducted are having, but that is something that does happen when you deprive yourself from sleep.
Of course, and again, this is ancient, right? Like, humans have been having this problem for a long time, and in fact, sleep paralysis and insomnia and having night terrors, right? This is sort of, again, existed in folklore, again, across cultures, not just here in the West, but in Africa and Asia and the Middle East. People often ascribe night terrors and sleep paralysis in ancient cultures and cultures around the globe to being some kind of access point to another reality or another version of reality. I know I'm Canadian, so in Canada we have a significant indigenous population, and one aspect of a spiritual journey is to purposefully not sleep, is to purposefully stay awake for a long time and place yourself into incredibly uncomfortable situations, to deprive yourself of sort of comfort, and even sort of self-harm at times, where often young men or young women, and especially sort of more shamanistic practice would be literally cut yourself and burn yourself. And the idea is to, as you place yourself in more positions of discomfort, your mind opens itself to communicating with what they would refer to as the spirit world. And this practice still occurs. Sweat lodges are common practice, in Canada, where I'm from, for Indigenous people, where you literally go into a tent and you just sit in a hot tent for hours and hours and hours. And the idea is, as you become uncomfortable, the broader world opens up to you. There's something to be said for this. I mean, cultures have been doing this for a long time, and there's probably a good reason for it. It probably does open the mind to something beyond just, the everyday reality we sort of exist in, the 9 to 5, drive into Starbucks and get your coffee reality. So, I think your son, and I think that Project Oculus, and potentially, the Edgar Mitchell Foundation and Kathy Martin's work, if that is the case, if there are links here, maybe we're dealing with something. Maybe we can potentially find some evidence to support the fact that people who are in these marginal states, these places of discomfort in their lives, are more open to strange experience. Right. It's definitely a place to go.
So, along your thoughts, where do you think the Rendlesham Forest fits in? As far as, I'm talking about the integrity of the witnesses, the people like right. Colonel Halt, who absolutely did not want this thing to get out at all. And you listen to him talk today, and it's pretty solid, what he saw. Not to say he knew what he saw, but what do you think of cases like that? And how he could have interpreted it, or they could have, as a group witnesses?
Rendlesham's a tough one to talk about. It's a tough one to talk about because at the end of the day, I'm still a bit of a skeptic. I'm not saying that Rendlesham didn't happen. I don't say that at all. I think that there's a lot of issues with the Rendlesham case from the witness standpoint. Some witnesses claim that they interacted with alien beings and they saw them and they got into some sort of triangular object, or they came out of one rather. And then some witnesses, say, we just sort of saw this light, and there's a lot of variation, I think, from witness testimony. As for Colonel Halt himself, who I think is probably one of the most reliable witnesses in the case, I think he definitely witnessed something anomalous. Again, I don't know what it was. The light flying around and the beams of light coming down and all that. The debunkers would say it's a lighthouse. I would argue it's not, because I don't know how you confuse those things. But ultimately, I think you have someone who walked into a strange situation and was unable to explain the reality of what was going on. And on his tape recorder, he did the best he could. And even today, as he talks about Rendlesham, he's doing the best he can to interpret something strange and anomalous that is sort of objectively occurring from his own position, from his own human flawed background. And when we experience anything strange, when we experience anything anomalous or anything even scary or frightening, like you said before, right, it's a matter of evolution. We sort of defer to things we understand. I don't know if Colonel Halt saw an extraterrestrial spacecraft. I don't. I wasn't there. No, even if I was there, I probably wouldn't still know. All I do know is that he came to that experience from his background, his military training, from being a colonel in the military during the Cold War, during tense times with the Soviet Union. He's going to interpret that object from that background, and it would be interesting to sort of see if we could almost time travel in a sense to bring someone from the 21st, from today, to see that, to be at that same moment and to see that. How would it be interpreted? Would it be interpreted differently? I think it would be. I think it's a totally different. It depends on the person, I think, to interpret the UFO question, or to interpret the UFO sighting rather, and any answer to that question is going to sort of be subjective to that person, at least for now, until we can sort of, like you say, study this in a more scientific way. So yeah, again, I don't want to sort of derail the conversation, but Rendlesham Forest is something I'm relatively not skeptical about, but there's issues, I think, with some of the witnesses that definitely can't be ignored.
Well, there's definitely been a lot of infighting, and there's been
significant.
Jem saying that he was downloading this information, binary code and stuff like that. I'm going to actually Penniston. I'm actually going to have him on the show eventually. He says he'll be on eventually, and that part is really difficult to swallow. But and the part about drugging is really interesting. The aftermath of the whole situation. Now, when I asked last time I had Chuck Halt on, I asked him straight out. I said, "What do you interpret it? What do you think it was?" And he said, "Extraterrestrial." He 100% thinks that's what it was. And I think it's, I understand where you're coming from. It would be a hard thing to explain otherwise. He saw this thing that looked like an eyeball bouncing around in the woods, dropping like magna. Very strange, and then it burst into 5 lights. And I also have a friend who saw a UFO burst into 5 lights. It really is very strange. What's that? Yeah.
So the question, so the question is, why do they think, how does that, so seeing that light sort of move into 5 shapes and move around, and the sort of the lights pouring down, like that laser or the magma or whatever it was, what is the link then from that to extraterrestrials? What makes a person make that logical leap from seeing an anomalous series of lights in the sky to automatically aliens from another planet?
I think the thing
that is what I'm interested
I think the thing when was overhead and it shot down that beam of light, a very strange beam of light, by the way. He said it wasn't a normal, it didn't react like a normal beam of light would just go down on the ground. This was very strange, the way it came down and everything. I think that more than anything else was probably what made him decide that it had to be something not from this world. That's my guess.
Sure, and I can understand. Like I can definitely say, okay, it's behaving strangely. It's not behaving like a man-made craft, which is fine. But again, seeing lights in the sky does not necessarily sort of correlate to it being then a spaceship from another planet. It correlates to seeing something odd in the sky to being a strange event, an anomalous event. But the issue here is why is it always automatically aliens from another planet and not potentially something else? What if it's some intelligence that's not necessarily alien interacting with the colonel and his men? What if it's their own personal sort of archetypal anxieties kind of pushing themselves outward and becoming real, as Jung would potentially say? What if it's I don't know. God, we could speculate all day, right? We could say it's I don't know, some ancient beings on this planet that have existed here for years. How do I know it's not angels or God or anything, right? Like to suggest that it's automatically aliens from another planet versus sort of anything else that it could potentially be, that's quite the leap in logic, right? Do you sort of understand what I'm
I do.
saying here?
I think that most of the time when someone just absolutely thinks it's extraterrestrial right off the bat without really thinking about it. But I think he's had a long time to think about this. And I think that's, his conclusion now. Now, a couple of things. What about when something's tracked on radar and, it's going 20,000 miles an hour and all of a sudden stops and goes another direction? How can that, when that's actually data right there. And
right.
How could that be interpreted differently in your mind?
Yeah, sure. And this often comes up, right? This often comes up. I was having this conversation with Greg Bishop, who runs the Radio Mysterioso podcast, and he and I were talking about. He has a theory that he's sort of playing with called the co-creation hypothesis, and he believes that whatever that other is, we bring sort of 99% of our interpretation to it. So I did ask him, and there's actually, I think we did a podcast on this as an interview where I sort of asked him, what do you say about the radar data? Like, how does this thing show up on radar moving 20,000 miles an hour? And he, we sort of threw it back and forth, and we were coming up with different theories. And I came up with this idea that it's sort of like a shapeshifter, and I have a blog post actually called Involuntary Shapeshifters, but where I talk about this and I expand upon this idea of, let's say we're dealing with, and I'm just speculating here, I'm just sort of spitballing on my own sort of crazy theory. Let's say we're dealing with some sort of intelligence that exists out there around us, sort of wherever it is, but it's not alien, it's not from another planet, it's not extraterrestrials, it's just an intelligence that's sort of part of sort of the consciousness of humanity. And let's say we sort of bump into it. My theory is that this intelligence has evolved in a way that it's now forced to sort of adapt itself to our interpretation of it. So if I'm sitting there and I'm flying a plane, and then suddenly this thing comes screaming past me, what I had a moment with was this anomalous thing, this anomalous other, this intelligent other, whatever it is, and the way I interpreted it, that 99% of co-creation that I brought to it was a craft flying past me at 20,000 miles an hour, and then it automatically stops and zigs in another direction. What essentially I've done is I've created the reality for that thing. I have made it what it is. it exists in its objective sense, whatever it is. I don't know because I'm not it. It's out there. When I see it, when I interact with it in some way, when I have my experience with it, it then takes shape. It shape shifts into what I want it to be. And then it shows up on radar, for example, at some airfield in, Missouri or whatever. I think ultimately this, we played with this idea, and Greg didn't love it. He said, that's silly. And I said, I know, it's philosophy. It's all silly. And I don't necessarily believe it. I'm just sort of saying, this potentially could be how it occurs. It could be that whatever this intelligence is, it's adapted itself to become the reality we make for it. When it bumps into something intelligent like you and I, it sort of coalesces into the thing we interpret it to be, what we ideologically sort of make it. And in this case, it becomes a physical object tracked on radar at 20,000 miles an hour, which zigs and zags in sort of defying the laws of physics. It's a leap for sure in a bit of theory, but it does fill holes that the extraterrestrial hypothesis leaves open. Which is how come then alien spacecraft don't show up on radar all the time, because there's UFO sightings all the time. One would think these would be on radar 24/7, but they're not. Sometimes they defy radar, right? So how come some alien craft defy radar and some don't? What is the reason for this? What's the logical reason?
They forgot to flick the switch,
Yeah, right? Like the cloak.
Yeah.
Damn it, Larry, turn the... Yeah.
It's Harry's fault. Yeah. Yeah.
That's right, yeah. And that's the thing, right? We kind of then speculate. We kind of say, well, they must have forgot to turn the switch, and, well, yes, maybe.
And then, it's kind of like the same, along the lines of USOs, people are seeing things go into the water. It's strange. I understand where you're coming from and all that, but also people interpreting a UFO as a UFO. Do you think this all began like in let's say the modern UFO? You were talking about 1947. There were tons of sightings that year. In the 1952, it was going crazy. Yeah. So do you think it's part of like a cultural mass hysteria?
No, I don't necessarily think it's part of a mass hysteria. Do I think that, potentially you have millions of people thinking about it? Does that add some fuel to the fire of whatever this thing is? Maybe. Again, and I don't want to come off saying that this is sort of what I 100% think is going on. I really don't know what's going on. This is just sort of a theory I've been sort of playing around with. It's kind of like what I believe, but I'm not going to sort of stick my my flag into it and say this is 100% my belief system, because I can't. I have no evidence to support this belief system apart from just some basic philosophy. I think flaps do provide an interesting. I think flaps provide a very interesting kind of motivation potentially for whatever this is. Maybe it sort of tends to show itself to a whole lot of people at certain times, or maybe mass hysteria is what brings it forward. Maybe a whole bunch of people being uncomfortable makes it manifest. This is an interesting idea to play with. 1967 was a major flap year, like you said, 52, 47. I think 2006 actually was a major flap year recently. What you have is potentially a significant amount of sort of discomfort globally, or at least in a country or in a nation or within like a hemisphere, and potentially this anxiety is causing this thing to manifest itself. It can sense our fear. It can sense our sort of collective discomfort. And if Project Oculus and Jeff Ritzmann are right, it's discomfort that makes it come out, right? So if everyone's uncomfortable, if there's sort of mass anxiety, maybe flaps occur for that reason. It's an interesting. I never thought about it that way. That's great. Wow.
A revelation right here, live.
Right, like Eureka, right? There's a blog post going to happen right now because of that one.
Yeah, someone on the chat room wants to know why you think you're a UFO expert, but I'm going to say that you're probably going to say you're not.
Oh, I am certainly not a UFO expert. There's no such thing as UFO expert. I would ask anyone, if anyone who claims to be a UFO expert, I would ask them sort of what gives them the insight to understand what's actually happening out there, because certainly no one does.
I agree with you on that. All right, why do you think the Air Force would have taken this serious back, to start Project Sign and then Project Blue Book? Why would they take it so serious?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I can't speak for the Air Force. I think what you had, though, was you probably had a mixing of a lot of anxieties, right? You would have had, I'm sure, the Air Force, there was probably a point where the Air Force was concerned that this was potentially, Soviet technology, and then obviously they learned it wasn't, but reports were still coming in, and I'm sure you had a lot of people who were in the military concerned about some sort of foreign aggressor, and even concerned about alien aggressors. Like, why not, right? I mean, it was the 1940s and 50s. People believe strange things all the time. I think where the UFO question sort of became important, and I think why it still is important, is that people are still seeing things. And I think that this is sort of the key situation, or the key point here. People still have anomalous experiences. It's the 21st century, and what we know now from what we knew in 1947 is exponentially expanded. We know significantly more about the universe today than we knew in 1947. In fact, what we knew in 1947 is laughable compared to what we sort of know about the cosmos and what we know about physics and what we know about chemistry and everything. But people still have sightings. People still have anomalous experiences. Even with our technological know-how, and even with our ability to understand the world around us, people still have weird moments where this thing lands in my backyard, a door opens, and a giant 4-foot owl walks out and looks at me. Like, people still have these odd moments, and they record them, and they contact MUFON, and they tell people about them. And they write it on Facebook, and they go on podcasts like this, and they talk about these odd experiences they have. And in the 21st century, right, people would normally kind of be like, hey, listen, I don't know what I saw. I saw a 4-foot owl. It was the strangest thing in the world. I'm just going to write this one off. But we don't. We don't for some reason. And we don't because these experiences, I think, are happening to people. People are legitimately experiencing these anomalous events, and they can't explain them. And they know 4-foot owls don't walk out of spaceships sort of that landed in their yard. But it still seems to be happening. And not only that, and you can replace 4-foot owl with a gray or a reptilian or an insectoid or whatever you want to call it, right? Whatever, variation of extraterrestrials, we have now in the narrative of the UFO discourse. But people still have strange experiences, and I think this is key. I think we need to go back to the witness accounts here, and I think we need to let go of all of that ideological baggage we bring to the UFO question. Whether we believe it's extraterrestrials or not, we need to let go of all that, and we need to approach the UFO question from the standpoint of the witness, because ultimately they're the one on the ground having that experience. And it's difficult, and it's difficult because when we deal with a UFO case, we walk into it with what we think happened, and what we think is okay to believe in, and what we think is crazy to believe in. When somebody says, I was in my backyard and this thing descended and out walked a gray, some people are more willing to believe that than someone who says a 4-foot owl walked out. The big question is why? What evidence does there exist that grays exist versus 4-foot owls that walk out of spaceships? Is it less odd? Maybe. Is it because we're just used to hearing about grays and not 4-foot owls? I don't know. But ultimately, I would say we need to look at every case kind of evenly and equally. We can't give certain cases sort of more credit, especially in high strangeness, than others. Because, again, there's no evidence to support any of it, right? So why are some cases more legitimate when there's no evidence? versus we call some illegitimate or delusional. But again, they still have the same amount of evidence, zero, to support them, apart from a story.
Right. Well, when it comes to witnesses and how they interpret, how does like a mass sighting with multiple witnesses that are basically saying they're seeing the same thing, how would that work for how people interpret things according to your thoughts?
Right, like my crackpot theory, yeah. This gets touched on sort of again in that article, involuntary shapeshifters, and Greg Bishop and I talk about this, and this touches on the same thing, sort of concerning the radar hit, is if a group of people are standing there, whatever this is, it sort of chooses or it is forced to take on some sort of physical form, whether it's lights in the sky, whether it's a flying saucer, whether it's a black triangle, or whether it's a gray, or whether it's a 4-foot owl. It kind of just does. And then it becomes that thing, and then everyone's kind of looking at it. So, take Phoenix Lights, which is this, beautiful UFO case. Still shrouded in mystery, and I love it. I think Phoenix Lights is one of my favorite UFO cases. You have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people seeing the same thing, right? They see this sort of triangular, massive, several mile long object in the sky. According to I'm going to call it hypothesis. According to my hypothesis, which is just my crazy crackpot theory, what you have, I think, is whatever that anomaly was, whatever that intelligent other sort of manifesting itself as, it kind of went with what either one person sort of was interpreting or sort of the collective was interpreting. Again, if we buy into the idea that our unconscious is collective, our unconscious is unified, which is what Carl Jung would say, and others would say as well, that our unconscious minds are all tied into one another. Whatever occurred in Phoenix, that thing tied into whatever the collective unconsciousness was of that town at the time, and became that several mile long triangular shape object. That would be sort of my take on co-creation with Greg Bishop, and that would sort of be my take on my sort of collective unconscious Jungian hypothesis of what's going on. Do I know that's what happened? Of course not. Hell, it could have been, an alien species from another planet. But ultimately, this is sort of my interpretation, at least right now, on what I think occurred in Phoenix. We get the same thing in Chicago O'Hare in 2006, where you have, a whole bunch of people see this disc descend, kind of hover over the airport for a while, and then it kind of shoots back up into the sky, right? Again, whatever this anomaly was, it sort of tied into the collective unconsciousness of the people present, and it became what that collective unconsciousness needed it to become. The reality was shaped for it by that collective unconsciousness. I sort of extrapolate upon this. This is tough to do sort of in a 2-hour podcast, but there's an article I wrote on my blog that you can sort of read up, where I kind of get into the details here a little bit more about Jungian psychology and what Jung meant when he was talking about the collective unconscious and how we all sort of are tied into it together. It's a little mystical, but it's an interesting way of looking at the UFO question. And it definitely, like I said, fills a few gaps that the extraterrestrial hypothesis leaves.
Now, you hear sometimes that there's like energy connecting all of us in.
Exactly.
Yeah. And
that's
go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of, we hear this sort of in paranormal circles, right? Or we see this at UFO conferences, right? People selling crystals and stuff. Ultimately, this is kind of a similar idea. I think they've sort of potentially bastardized it a little bit, but yeah, ultimately Jung would sort of argue the same thing. We are all connected via our unconscious mind, and this is sort of psychoanalytical psychology. We sort of all think similar things about the universe around us. We all have similar thoughts about what's good and what's bad when it comes to sort of the world out there. We all, for some reason, get that feeling that we're being watched, and we kind of start looking around a bit, or we get feelings of deja vu, and all that, and that's universal. Jung would argue anyway, the way we interpret dreams are universal. So ultimately, is there something that exists within this universal consciousness that's intelligent and manifesting itself? Maybe. Jung would say yes. And like I said, I've become Jungian in my old age. But again, it's my hypothesis. It's nothing more than that. It's just philosophical rumination. And that's kind of the point, and that's kind of what my mission, I think, is in the UFO world. I'm not here to make claims about what UFOs are. I don't know what UFOs are. I don't think anyone knows what UFOs are. All I can do is just sort of propose philosophical ideas that challenge the current UFO sort of mythology that exists out there. And I think the extraterrestrial hypothesis is definitely a big UFO myth. Not that it's not real, it's just that it's a story we kind of hear over and over and over again, and it's definitely become the base of UFO discourse, and we need to question why that is. Why do we believe that it's aliens and not something else? And that's kind of what I'm trying to do.
There are a lot of people out there that could care absolutely less about, UFOs or sightings, or have never even thought about it. What happens when they have a sighting, when they're not even paying attention to any part of the UFO field, or may have not even heard about anyone have a sighting? I don't think it's everywhere that, I think it's a very small percentage of people like you and I are even discussing the topic or thinking about the topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the UFO community is very much a subculture, right? Like, we are not, part of the mainstream. But, UFOs have very much permeated the mainstream, like the poster behind me, right, is from a television show on Fox that, millions and millions of people have watched. So, while I think the core of people like you and I, right, who talk about UFOs sort of all the time, and we sort of live in the world of UFOs, we might be small, but you can ask anyone what a UFO is, and they'll be able to tell you, right? They'll be able to tell you this is what, I've been told it is, because, History Channel or Discovery Channel had this show about MUFON or whatever, or the X-Files or Star Trek or anything. So, it's interesting, right? When we talk about people who are not in any way involved in the UFO world have a sighting, I would say they fundamentally already have had sightings, right? They've seen them on TV all the time, right? People have seen black triangles and flying saucers and aliens. You go out into the world, you go out into any Walmart, and there's little toy aliens and spaceships and all that stuff. So they've already been exposed to the idea of what a UFO is. They've all been exposed to the idea of what a flying saucer is or what a gray is, because they've seen the movies, they've seen the documentaries. And just because they don't think about it on a daily basis doesn't mean they can't have an experience. And just because they don't think about it on a daily basis doesn't mean that these shows aren't on TV still. And I would argue that probably the vast majority of people on this, especially in the West, in North America, definitely sort of see UFOs all the time. Not necessarily sort of anomalous ones in the sky, but they see it on TV a lot, or in movies, or in books or magazines or whatever, the internet. So what we then need to sort of establish is when a skeptic, or when someone who doesn't deal with UFOs at all has an anomalous experience, are they seeing an objective flying saucer made of metal or whatever the material is, being piloted by little beings who are 3 feet tall and have big heads, and they're actually seeing that objectively as a thing, just like the table in front of us, or are they seeing something and their mind is interpreting that something as that metal disc with little men flying it? And I think, again, that's the question I like to wrestle with. Is there an objective UFO piloted by aliens, or is it something else? Is it an anomalous event that you and I are approaching from our own place and interpreting in our own way? And this is the point of my sort of philosophical work within the UFO world.
So do you think if someone was along your lines, you could still thinking along your lines, they could still talk about witnesses like several police officers. There was that case where it went through several state or 3 or 4 states where they were following it. And do you think they would interpret something as, a flying saucer from out of this world type of thing? How does that happen? You hear the reports.
Sorry, I'm not sure how. Oh, sorry, can you repeat the question?
All right, let's say the case of, I can't remember when it was. It happened in the Midwest, Ohio, and then it went through like 3 states and all through the morning and the night, where all these police officers were basically chasing this UFO.
Right.
They saw something. You think, in your terms, they saw something, but not necessarily a UFO, strange UFO object. Same thing with the Belgium, triangle flap. What were these people seeing, and how did they interpret it the way they did? If it wasn't what they say it was.
Right. So again, if we sort of go along this theory, if we kind of follow it to sort of a conclusion here, whatever that thing was, that anomaly, that intelligence, whatever it was, became that object. It sort of manifested itself as that flying saucer or black triangle or the Phoenix Lights delta wing. It manifested itself as that, and then it sort of went along its way, and people saw it all along the way. The police officers who saw the flying disc or whatever it was across 3 states, when it first became that flying disc, it would have sort of remained that until that experience ended. Again, if we're dealing with this idea of a universal consciousness, a universal consciousness, again, we're all connected, right? So if a police officer in Ohio sees something, his sort of unconscious mind is tied in with everyone else. It's just kind of becoming what it needs to become for us to see it, for us to experience it. So it takes the shape of a flying disc or a black triangle or whatever. To kind of reverse your question a little bit, why did these police officers in the United States see a flying saucer? And why did the people in Belgium have a black triangle flap? If it's extraterrestrials, why did the extraterrestrials change the shape of their vehicle?
Yeah, they have many different models.
Right, and that becomes some curious statement that we make about extraterrestrial hypothesis, right? Oh well, yeah, this is how I explain that, because they have different types of ships. It's like, okay, sure. So they have flying discs for one reason, and then they have black triangles for another, and then how about the ovals or the delta wings? And I mean, we can keep going. The problem with the extraterrestrial hypothesis is it's incredibly relative. We can just spiral into chaos, and we can explain everything by just adding more stuff, right? We just add more shapes, and they've got different types of vehicles, and this one can do this speed, and this one's designed for this type of truck. You know what I mean? Does that not sound kind of odd to anyone? I don't know. It seems it seems odd that an intelligence that can travel the stars would have different types of spaceships or stylistic ships for some reason, right?
There's a lot of people that attribute the military to black projects to the triangles,
right.
But the triangles have been around for quite a while. I mean, I have a friend who saw one in the 70s. They've been
right.
Tell you a quick story. I was doing my show in a different home that I'm in now. I was living in a condo at the time on a golf course, and during the show, my neighbor was pounding on the door. I didn't hear her, but she told me later. She said a huge triangle came over the golf course and floated over the golf course and then took off. And she was really scared. She was knocking on the door so I could come out and see it. So I told her, well, I do a show on UFOs, and I was actually doing one when this happened. This is amazing. I
Awesome.
said, can you come back next week and be on my show? This is great. She goes, oh, no, I don't believe in UFOs. There's no way. And I said, no, you can be anonymous. She goes, there's no way. I'm not going to be on your show. Nothing to do with UFOs. And she never actually talked to me again. It was she kept her distance from me.
And UFOs have this effect, right? Like, we have this anxiety about the idea of the UFO. We have this anxiety about this concept that there's something else out there, right? That's intelligent and doing things, right? That's sort of meddling in our world, right? You know, we as humans live on this planet, and we kind of go to bed every night comfortable in the fact that we're the top dog. You know, there is nothing else on this planet that's bigger than us on the food chain, right? We can outgun everything, right? It doesn't matter sort of the biggest predator out there. It doesn't compare to us. You know, if we need to, we can move a mountain out of the way, right, to build a train track through it or whatever. You know, because we have this massive intelligence, right? That you know, because we're human. UFOs and the idea of an intelligent other is really frightening, because we lose then our control over the planet. We lose the control over ourselves. We lose control over the way we govern our lives on a day-to-day basis. If there is something else that is intelligent, and not only that, is intelligent enough that it can kind of outmaneuver us, or it can outgun us, or it can sort of disappear or reappear at random, or it just doesn't really care what we think and just kind of goes about its merry way. This kind of freaks people out, and I think rightfully so. UFOs are definitely an anxious and sort of frightening thing. Nobody wants to go to bed at night thinking that, you know, something's better than they are, or something's bigger than they are, and they can't control it. For people, this is scary. We like to remain on top, and you know, UFOs definitely throw that under the bus.
Yes, and I think you know, that's part of the reason, you know, the Air Force, you know, they had no control of what was going on, you know, no matter what it was, right. And you know, and that's I think that's why they, you know, stepped away from it. You know, nothing was happening in any serious way to affect anyone that they knew of.
Yeah.
So what do you think about Robert Bigelow? Did you hear his statement on 60 Minutes, what he thought about UFOs and coming to the Earth?
You know what? I heard it happen, but I didn't sort of listen to it. Can you give me a quick paraphrase?
Sure. So he was being interviewed by Lara Logan, and she said, do you believe that UFOs have come to this Earth? And there's his answer was, there has been an existence presence, an ET presence. And I've spent millions and millions of dollars, probably spent more than any individual ever has in the United States as ever on this subject. And, you know, basically he just was saying he didn't give a damn. He didn't care what people thought. He didn't care if they thought he was crazy or whatever. You know, he just knew what he knew. And so, yeah, I mean, you haven't really had time to really digest any of that, but...
No. But I think he makes sort of a similar claim that a lot of people in the UFO world sort of claim, right? They say, like, I know it's aliens, right? Or I know it's extraterrestrials. I think we can sort of walk away from any UFO event, from any UFO sighting or any contact event or any abduction event. We can walk away not necessarily saying that I know 100% they're extraterrestrials from another planet. I think we can walk away saying something strange happened, something anomalous happened, and it was intelligent. That's sort of what we can walk away with. To say anything more than that, to say anything more than it was anomalous and strange and intelligent, you know, I think that's okay, because there's evidence for that type of sort of argument. To then say they're aliens from this planet, now we're kind of going on a totally different... We're making a huge logical leap here into just what I personally believe to be happening, or what someone personally believes to be happening. And I think that this is...
Well, he didn't really explain why he saying he knew what he knew. Is just the fact that he knew it because he spent millions of dollars on the subject to look into it.
Okay, so that does that mean he spoke to one of them? Like, does that mean he bought a meeting and they came down and they were like, yeah, it's 100%, you know, this, and we're from this planet, and then they took, like, you know, I don't know. This is again just, I think he's just sort of making a belief claim here. One thing I'll say is he's definitely saying that there is something strange going on, right? I mean, but can he definitely prove that it's extraterrestrial? Can he prove that it's meet bodies like you and I from another planet coming here? I don't think so, because I'm sure he would have come out with the proof if he had it.
And just say that we are being visited. Let's just throw that out there. Let's say we are being visited.
Yeah.
Why would you think that it's been so long with so many interested people not being able to grasp any hard evidence?
Right. And this is ultimately the problem, right, with the extraterrestrial hypothesis, is that, there's no real evidence. There's a few pieces of physical evidence that we sort of say are dubious, right? Like there's been a few, what people claim when they've been abducted have had like probes removed by, the implants removed, right? But again, the result, like none of the results that come back from any of the tests regarding those things are, oh my God, this is a metal we've never seen before, or whatever. They sort of come back, odd and strange, but they're not sort of smoking gun evidence. So all of the evidence is relatively dubious. If it is extraterrestrials like you and I, they're doing a very good job of covering their tracks. Furthermore, for a group of people who've crashed their spaceships so many times into this planet, whether it's Roswell or Aztec or wherever, they keep slamming their spaceships into the Earth. The fact that no one's found anything is surprising. This is fundamentally the problem with extraterrestrial hypothesis. It's been a long time, and people have claimed we've been visited for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, right? Ancient aliens would posit that, this is not a new thing, this is an ancient thing. And again, there is literally no smoking gun evidence that we can say, 100% here it is. They're doing an amazing job of covering their tracks. Now, if it's not extraterrestrial, let's say it's an intelligence that simply manifests itself physically at times. Well, it makes sense nothing would be left behind, because when it simply, when it leaves the reality we exist in, it kind of takes everything with it, right? It leaves our sort of interpretation of reality, and it kind of returns to wherever its home is, or not home. That's a weird way of saying it. It returns to kind of wherever its place is in sort of our unconsciousness or within the sort of the linked sort of reality that we can't access. Sometimes people say multiverse, for example, right? Stranger Things would call it the upside down. If it's not bodies of meat like you and I flying in spaceships, it's something else, then that makes sense why there's no physical evidence being left behind. One would think at some point, just like Larry, the alien who forgets to turn the cloaking on and it gets a radar hit, one would think one would make a mistake at some point, or would screw up, or, they've crashed at Roswell apparently, so, clearly there must be some shred of evidence out there, and there's zero chance, the American military in 1947 could clean it all up. I don't know, I find ETH dubious. So, to get sort of back to your question, if we are being visited, let's say by aliens, sorry, I totally forgot your question, actually.
Yeah, why do you think the evidence has been elusive for so long?
Yeah. So, that's sort of, that's how I started, I guess. It's because there is no evidence, right? Like, fundamentally, I don't think it's extraterrestrial from another planet. I think that's why the evidence is elusive, is because ultimately, I just don't think they're literally flying here in metal spaceships visiting us. I don't think that's what we're dealing with. Because if they were doing that, there would be evidence.
Well, there's we think there would be evidence, but again, that's thinking along our lines of making mistakes, and if they were intelligent enough to be here, perhaps they don't want to be, totally discovered or evidential to disrupt our society type of thing.
Right. So then you have to ask those same people, did they crash at Roswell, or do they crash at other places? Because there's apparently been dozens of UFO crashes in the last 70 years. So again, if they're hyper advanced and intelligent and they don't make mistakes, are we then do those people still believe in Roswell as a case? Mm-hmm. Right? And this is interesting, right? It's interesting to say they're so hyper advanced that they have this amazing technology and they don't screw up. Meanwhile, they crashed at Roswell, which doesn't necessarily correlate in logic.
It was Harry forgot to push the button that they were in the,
Right,
the atmosphere.
again, the guy. So let's just say Roswell's nothing happened at Roswell. Let's just say it was a balloon or something, right? And let's say we are being visited, just for the sake of argument. We're being visited by a hyper intelligent species that does not make mistakes, and they just cover their tracks perfectly. I suppose then potentially we could just be dealing with technology so advanced that it seems like magic to us, right? They leave nothing behind because maybe their version of reality doesn't leave stuff behind in our version. I don't know, it could be anything. I've written a lot of articles about a theory posited by a physicist named Caleb Scharf. He says that perhaps a hyper advanced alien species would upload itself into the laws of physics itself. They would leave behind physical bodies and they would become part of the universe. They would sort of become one with sort of matter within the universe. And he wrote an article, I believe, for The Atlantic. And then I wrote it for Mysterious Universe. I sort of talked about his idea. And maybe this is what's going on. Maybe we are communicating with something hyper intelligent, but it doesn't leave traces because it's not physical like you and I are physical. It exists within the fabric of the universe itself. It's part of matter itself, and it just kind of shows up when it wants to. Who knows, right?
That is interesting.
There's going to be a point where you reach such a technological advancement that you no longer need a physical body. You would simply become energy itself, potentially. You could upload yourself into dark matter or dark energy or whatever other sort of quantum physical idea that science is currently playing around with. So I gotta be honest, if it is extraterrestrials visiting us, and they're in so hyper advanced beyond us, they're probably not physical anyway, right? They're probably not made out of meat like you and I are made out of meat, because I gotta be honest, this form of living, it's flawed, right? It dies eventually. It fades away. If you really wanted to survive forever, if you really wanted to ensure your species would exist for infinity, you become part of the universe itself, right? You become part of the building blocks that make up the universe.
That's an interesting theory to me, and also along the same lines, a lot of people talk about how things will disappear right in front of their eyes, and that would kind of fit that. But I like that, and that's very interesting. We have Leslie in the chat room that wanted to know what you think about the way the UFO experience has changed over the decades, the collective unconscious and the Space Brothers, for example.
Yeah, well, I mean, you see this across, we can even go back into the 1800s, right? In the 1800s, people weren't seeing flying saucers and they were seeing airships. Like, they were literally seeing balloons with men with strange accents, wearing coveralls and climbing down on ladders and asking for water, and then exchanging American currency for like oil and gas. And then, moving from there, as our technology changes, as our technology adjusts, so too does our unconscious, right? So too does our perception of the world around us. And as we move technologically into sort of today, the 21st century, sort of clearly our technological ability is going to influence sort of our unconscious mind and our conscious mind as well. It's going to shape our belief system. It's going to shape the way we perceive the world around us. So, talking about the Space Brothers, and then it was, I think it was in the 1960s or the late 50s, early 60s was right. The whole space brother movement. Well, I mean, you can clearly see this idea of sort of these hippie space men from Venus who sort of talk about cosmic love and instead of building nuclear weapons, we should just hug it out. Well, this was very much kind of the zeitgeist of the 1950s and 60s, right? The hippie movement, and into the 70s, the hippie movement was sort of beginning, and civil rights was sort of occurring in the early 60s, late 50s. You had these movements of people who were afraid of basically getting nuked into oblivion, and were going the total opposite way, right? We need to share, and we need to sort of live in communion, and we need to, be friends with one another instead of trying to kill each other. What's the song by Buffalo Springfield, right? How does it go? Stop, baby, what's that sound?
Yeah.
Right? What am I thinking here?
You're coming in the last part of it, but I know there's something going on here. What it is ain't exactly clear.
Exactly.
Okay, I don't have a singing voice.
Neither do I. But I think we got the point across, right? This sort of ideological shift, for sure, that occurred from the exploration and breaking of the West in the United States and airships and that sort of ideological movement of we're moving out west and we're sort of going out into parts of Midwest and Western United States with these airships and these amazing propeller flying devices into the nuclear age and into the 21st century, where today I'm not sure if people see flying saucers anymore. I have to be honest, very rarely have I had in the last couple of years a flying saucer report. It was always a black triangle or it was an orb. So they don't have shapes anymore, right? They sort of shapeshift and they are just lights. And I think we're kind of at the dawn of another ufological age. I think we're going to sort of leave physical craft behind as sightings. Sort of as we deal with sightings of UFOs, we're going to, I think, leave behind physical craft, and it's going to be something else. I think we're going to be dealing with more orb-like UFO, orb-like sort of UFO encounters or sightings.
Yeah, it'd be interesting if we could go ahead in time 100 years from now, if there is no evidence at that time, where this would have transformed to. Speaking of that, 1946, you had the ghost rockets in Sweden, where they looked like sort of like missiles, and they all landed in lakes. And as recent as the late 1970s, people were seeing these things. That's just such another bizarre twist in the story of UFOs.
Oh, for sure. And like you said, right, people were seeing black triangles in the 1970s and up into the 90s and even today, right? And you sort of have these long, moments of progression, right? Of people start seeing a different type of UFO at a certain time, and then it kind of becomes more mainstream almost until it becomes kind of the norm. The black triangle was very much the norm in sort of the 80s and the 90s. And then, now we're kind of petering out, I think, a little bit. People still see them, for sure. Like, people still have those sightings, but it's not as significant as it was in the 90s, especially in Belgium, right? That was sort of the peak of black triangle UFO sightings. And for sure, the 1950s, 60s saw the saucers, right, and the 40s, and we don't, like I said, I'm not sure if people see saucer-shaped UFOs anymore, right? They're much different.
Yeah, I think there's. I do the news with Alejandro. We do the news on each other's shows, and there's still disc sightings. What I saw was a disc. I saw an old-fashioned UFO, I guess, but that was in 2006. But they're still seen. Triangles aren't the number one. There is statistics on what they see. Most of it's lights in the sky, of course. Orange orbs have taken a big jump ahead.
Yes.
But we have about 4 minutes left, and I just wanted to ask you, what type of flack do you get from people in the UFO field?
I think I generally... I want to be nice to everyone. I think the biggest hurdle I face is people need to let go of what they think they know. And I think they need to approach this phenomenon from the base point of, I have no idea. And if you can approach the UFO question from there, I have no idea what's going on, then you're going to get better answers to your questions, or at least you're going to be able to think about this differently. The biggest flack I get is from people who automatically have bought into one idea and one idea only. There's people out there who say it's 100% aliens, it's 100% extraterrestrials, and that's it. And when someone else comes in with a different idea, they really struggle with giving up their own bias and their own ideological sort of construct that they've built for themselves and potentially looking at this from another angle. I don't necessarily believe in my hypothesis 100%. It's just a hypothesis. It's just kind of one I'm playing with right now because it makes more sense to me than the extraterrestrial hypothesis does. I've not bought into it totally, but there's strength in that. I think because I haven't bought into anything, I'm open to a lot. If suddenly an alien showed up tomorrow and said, "Yeah, it's been us this whole time. We're from this planet," I'm in. Great, I'd buy it.
What do you think the future is as far as people interpreting this whole phenomena? Do you think it's going to go along the lines where it's going to keep growing? Do you think this is all part of popular culture? Or do you think, and then the last question I had for you is, you hear people often talk about UFO as a religion. Do you think there's part of that going on too?
Yeah, I think this all ties in together. I think the religious aspects of UFO belief are a huge portion of UFO discourse and the UFO narrative. I think popular culture plays a significant role in how we interpret the UFO phenomenon. I think sightings are going to continue. Whether they go up or down, I don't know, but they're definitely going to continue because I do think something strange is going on. If I had to kind of lay it all out, and if somebody said, what does MJ Banias believe in? It's that something strange is going on, and that's all I have. I don't think that strangeness is going to go away. I don't think that strangeness is just going to suddenly vanish and leave us alone. I think it's here with us, and it's been here with us for a long time, and we've been interacting with it for a long time. Mm-hmm. But I agree that the way we interpret this strangeness, whatever it is, it's hugely influenced by popular culture, and it's hugely influenced by people's desire to believe in something, and this is where that religious aspect comes in. I think this is a huge part of UFO discourse, is belief, and telling stories and buying into ideas, and unfortunately a huge part of the UFO discourse is people who know that and people who play upon that. Right? There's a lot of people out there who are going to say, I know what's going on, and you can be one of my followers, or you can know too, or you can be enlightened just like me if you pay me this, or if you buy this, or if you follow me, or if there's a lot of charlatans and snake oil salesmen out there because they know that a lot of people are looking for salvation.
Right. Dr. Stephen Greer, did I say that?
I didn't hear anything, but and there's one of many, right? Yeah. One of many. Yeah.
All right. Well, hey, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. I had a great time.
Oh, thanks very much.
All right,
it was a blast.
Throw your blog out there if you would.
Yeah, that'd be great. My blog is www.terraobscura.net. You can find all of my work there if you're interested in looking sort of at the culture of UFOs and the philosophy behind them. As well, I write for Mysterious Universe, which is a sort of much bigger than me. So it's great. I really enjoyed writing too.
All right, thanks so much. Yeah. And I'll talk to you soon, MJ. All right,
thanks very much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
All right, everyone, thanks so much for listening to the show tonight. And next week, we're going to try it again with the failed show last week with Tiago Tacheta. I have a hard time with his name, from Brazil. He'll be back next week. All right, so thanks for hanging in. If you support the show, thanks so much for helping us out. And remember to keep your eyes to the sky.